The first time Ezra Hutchins saw one of the pale things, he was hauling 2 jugs of shine through the Cumberland Gap at 3 in the morning. The fog had rolled in thick as cotton batting, the kind that makes you feel like you're walking through someone else's dream. Ezra had been running moonshine through these mountains for 6 years, ever since Prohibition turned every hillbilly with a still into an outlaw. And he thought he knew every rock, every tree, every animal sound these woods could throw at him. He was wrong. The thing stood about 30 yards off the trail, perfectly still in the swirling mist. At first, Ezra figured it was just a birch tree, the white bark playing tricks in the darkness. But then it moved, not like a person walks, more like it glided, smooth as oil on water. No footsteps, no rustling leaves, just this pale, elongated shape drifting between the trees like it had all the time in the world. Ezra dropped both jugs, didn't even hear them shatter. He ran the 3 miles back to his cousin's place without stopping. Without looking back, his heart hammering so hard he tasted copper in his mouth. When he finally burst through the door, gasping and wild-eyed, his cousin Micah took one look at him and said, "You seen one, didn't you?" That's when Ezra learned he wasn't the first. Now, before we go any further, I need to be straight with you about something. This isn't one of those stories where I'm going to tell you it was all swamp gas or mass hysteria or bootleggers seeing things because they'd been sampling their own product. I've spent the better part of 3 years collecting testimonies, reading through old county records, talking to the descendants of moonshiners who worked those mountains during Prohibition. What happened in the Appalachian Highlands between 1920 and 1933 was real. It was documented, and it was a hell of a lot stranger than anything you'll find in your average history book. The question isn't whether the pale things existed. The question is what they were, and why they appeared when they did. Let's start with the context, because context matters. By 1920, the 18th Amendment had turned the United States into officially dry territory. The Volstead Act made it illegal to manufacture, sell, or transport any beverage containing more than 0.5% alcohol. For most of America, this meant awkward dinner parties and a thriving black market. For the people living in the Appalachian Mountains, stretching from Georgia up through Kentucky, West Virginia, and into Pennsylvania, it meant something entirely different. These mountains had been producing whiskey since the Scots-Irish settlers arrived in the 1700s. It wasn't about getting drunk, it was economics. A farmer could grow a field of corn and haul it 40 miles to market on horseback, or he could turn that same corn into a few jugs of whiskey that were worth 10 times as much and a hell of a lot easier to transport. Whiskey was currency, it was medicine, it was tradition. When Prohibition hit, that tradition became a felony overnight. But here's the thing about mountain people, and I say this with respect, as someone with Appalachian roots herself, they've never been particularly impressed by what the government in Washington decides is legal. These were communities that had been isolated for generations, developing their own codes and customs. The federal government was an abstraction. Family was real, community was real, and moonshine was a livelihood, so they kept making it. Within months of Prohibition taking effect, the Appalachian region became the moonshine capital of America. Thousands of illegal stills sprung up in hidden hollows and creek beds, producing corn liquor that would make its way to cities across the East Coast. The demand was insatiable, the profits were enormous, and the risks were significant. The federal government responded by creating a special unit of Prohibition agents, revenue men, or revenuers, as the moonshiners called them. These agents had the authority to destroy stills, confiscate product, and arrest anyone involved in the illegal liquor trade. They worked in coordination with local law enforcement, though in many counties, the sheriffs and deputies were either on the moonshiners' payroll or running their own operations on the side. It was a cat-and-mouse game played in some of the most unforgiving terrain in America. The moonshiners had the home advantage. They knew every deer trail, every cave, every place where the laurel thickets grew so dense you couldn't push through them without a machete. They ran their shine at night, using routes that had been passed down through families for generations. The revenuers had the law, federal funding, and eventually wiretaps and informants. It should have been a straightforward conflict, moonshiners versus the law, but in late 1920, something else entered the equation. The fog. October of 1920 was unusually wet throughout the southern Appalachians. The autumn rains came early and stayed late, turning the mountain hollows into perpetual twilight zones of mist and moisture. This wasn't particularly unusual. The Appalachians are famous for their fog, especially in places like the Great Smoky Mountains. But old-timers that season remarked that this fog felt different, heavier, more persistent, and it seemed to pool in specific locations, particularly around the areas where moonshiners operated their stills. The first disappearances started in Cook County, Tennessee. James Whitlock ran a still operation about 8 miles up Cosby Creek, deep enough into the mountains that revenue agents rarely bothered him. He employed 4 men, his brother-in-law, 2 cousins, and a kid named Thomas Blevins, who couldn't have been more than 17. On October 23rd, Whitlock and his crew were working a night run when the fog rolled in. According to Whitlock's later testimony, given to the county sheriff, not the feds, mind you, they were loading up the night's production when Thomas Blevins said he needed to take a piss. Kid walked about 20 feet into the woods and never came back. They called for him, searched with lanterns, found nothing. No signs of struggle, no blood, no tracks. Just gone. Whitlock figured the kid had either gotten lost in the fog or maybe run off. Thomas had been talking about heading up north to find factory work. They packed up their jugs and headed down the mountain, uneasy but not yet alarmed. The next morning, Thomas Blevins's body was found by a farmer 3 miles away from the still site. Now here's where it gets interesting. The body was discovered in the middle of a cow pasture, lying face up in the grass. The farmer, a man named Sutton, said he'd passed through that same pasture at dawn to check on his livestock, and there had been nothing there. 2 hours later, Thomas Blevins was lying there like he'd been carefully placed. The local doctor, a respected man named Charles Farnsworth, examined the body. His official report is still available in the Cook County archives, and I've read it 3 times trying to make sense of it. According to Dr. Farnsworth, Thomas Blevins showed no signs of violence, no broken bones, no bruising, no wounds. But every visible vein in his body was darkened, as if his blood had turned black. His eyes were wide open, pupils so dilated there was barely any color visible, and his skin, Dr. Farnsworth described it as unnaturally cold and almost translucent, as if partially drained of blood, though no wounds were present to explain such a loss. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure brought on by unknown causes. Thomas Blevins's mother insisted on an open casket at the funeral. She wanted people to see what had been done to her son. I've talked to 3 people whose grandparents attended that service, and they all say the same thing. Thomas didn't look like Thomas anymore. He looked like something wearing Thomas's face. That should have been big news. Young man dies mysteriously, body found in an impossible location with impossible characteristics. But this was Prohibition-era Appalachia. The authorities knew Thomas had been working for a moonshiner. As far as the law was concerned, he'd chosen a criminal life and suffered the consequences. The case was quietly closed, but the moonshiners knew different. They'd lost one of their own under circumstances that didn't add up. And worse, word was starting to spread about what James Whitlock had seen in the fog while they were searching for Thomas. Whitlock didn't talk about it at first. Mountain men, especially those involved in illegal activities, don't go running their mouths about things they can't explain. But 2 weeks after Thomas died, Whitlock's brother-in-law quit the moonshine business entirely, packed up his family and moved to Asheville to work in a mill. When pressed about why he was giving up such profitable work, he would only say, "I ain't going back into those woods after dark, not for all the money in the world." Eventually, after several jugs of his own product, James Whitlock told the story to a group of fellow moonshiners at a barn gathering in November. One of the men present wrote down what he remembered years later, and that account made its way to a folklorist at the University of Tennessee in the 1960s. According to Whitlock, while they were searching for Thomas, he'd caught a glimpse of something moving through the fog. Something tall and white, weaving between the trees in a way that wasn't quite walking. He'd called out, thinking it might be the kid, but when his lantern light swept across it, he saw that it wasn't human at all. It was the wrong shape, Whitlock reportedly said. Too long in the arms, too long in the legs. Head weren't right neither, and the way it moved. Jesus Christ, the way it moved. like it was swimming through the air. When the lantern light hit it, the thing had stopped, turned toward him. Whitlock said he couldn't make out any features clearly through the fog, but he got the distinct impression it was looking at him, studying him. Then it had simply glided backward into the mist and vanished. Whitlock's story might have been dismissed as the ravings of a drunk moonshiner if it hadn't been for what happened next. Throughout November and December of 1920, 6 more moonshiners disappeared in the mountains of East Tennessee and western North Carolina. Not all at once, spread out enough that the pattern wasn't immediately obvious. But when you map them out, which I have, they all occurred in remote areas where stills were operating, and they all happened on foggy nights. 3 of the 6 were never found. 2 were discovered dead with the same characteristics as Thomas Blevins. No marks of violence, darkened veins, dilated pupils, skin cold and partially translucent. The 6th man, a moonshiner named Arthur Cole, survived, and his account is the most detailed testimony we have. Cole was running a still operation in Haywood County, North Carolina, near the Tennessee border. On December 17th, he and his partner were working late, trying to get a batch finished before the expected arrival of a buyer from Knoxville. The fog was thick that night, rolling down the mountain in waves. Around 2 in the morning, Cole's partner said he heard something moving around outside the still. Cole figured it might be a black bear. They were common in those mountains and sometimes got curious about the smell of fermenting mash. He grabbed a rifle and stepped outside to fire a warning shot. That's when he saw them, not one pale thing. 3 of them. They were standing at the edge of the clearing, barely visible through the fog. Cole said they were shaped roughly like people, but all wrong in the proportions. Too tall, he estimated 7 or 8 feet. Arms that hung down past where knees should be. Heads that seemed too narrow, tilted at angles that shouldn't have been comfortable. And they were moving closer. Cole fired his rifle directly at the nearest one. He was an experienced hunter, knew his aim was true. The bullet should have hit center mass. Instead, the pale thing rippled. That's the word he used. Rippled. Like the bullet passed through smoke or fog or water. The thing didn't fall, didn't cry out, didn't react at all except for this disturbance in its surface, like throwing a stone into a pond. Then all 3 of them moved toward him at once. Cole ran, abandoned his partner, abandoned his still, abandoned everything. He crashed through the woods in pure panic, the fog so thick he kept slamming into trees, tearing his clothes and skin. He said he could hear them behind him, not footsteps, but a sort of rushing sound, like wind through a tunnel. He didn't know how long he ran. Could have been minutes, could have been hours. Eventually, he burst out onto a road and flagged down a passing truck. A miracle at that hour. The driver was a bootlegger himself, running a load of shine to Asheville, and he could tell from Cole's condition that something bad had happened. They drove straight to the nearest town. Cole was so torn up from running through the forest that he had to spend 3 days recovering before he could go back to the still site. When he finally returned, in broad daylight, with 4 armed men accompanying him, the still was destroyed, not raided by revenue agents who would have smashed the equipment and dumped the product. This was different. The copper coils looked like they'd been pulled apart by hand, twisted into impossible shapes. The wooden structures were scattered like kindling. And his partner was gone. They found the man 2 days later, half a mile up the mountain. Same condition as the others. No violence, darkened veins, eyes wide open. Dead. Cole's story spread through the moonshine community like wildfire. And suddenly, all those other disappearances and deaths took on a new context. These weren't isolated incidents. Something was hunting moonshiners in the mountains. Now, I know what you're thinking. This sounds like folklore. Tall tales told by superstitious people trying to make sense of accidents and coincidences. And I'll admit, that was my first thought too when I started researching this. The Appalachian region has a rich tradition of supernatural storytelling. Not deer, the bell witch, haints and boogers and all manner of creatures that go bump in the night. But here's what separates the pale things from folklore: the documentation. Between 1920 and 1933, there are at least 47 recorded deaths in the Appalachian region that match the same pattern. Bodies found in impossible locations, no signs of violence, darkened veins and dilated pupils. Witnesses describing tall, pale figures in the fog. These aren't stories passed down through oral tradition. These are coroner's reports, sheriff's records, newspaper articles. The Knoxville Journal ran a small article in January 1921 titled "Mysterious Deaths Plague Mountain Communities." The article was vague, didn't mention moonshine or the pale things directly, but it acknowledged that something unusual was happening. Local doctors were baffled, people were scared, and the moonshiners were faced with a terrible choice: abandon their livelihoods or keep working in conditions that had become genuinely dangerous. Most chose to keep working, because what else could they do? These were people living on the economic margins already. Prohibition hadn't destroyed the demand for alcohol, it had just criminalized the supply. The money was too good, families depended on it, entire communities were built around the moonshine economy. But they adapted. By early 1921, moonshiners had developed a set of unwritten rules for operating in what they called fog country. These rules were passed from crew to crew, taught to new workers, refined through trial and error. Never work alone. Always have at least 3 people at a still site, preferably more. The pale things seemed less likely to approach larger groups. Burn fires. Keep multiple fires burning around the work area. Some moonshiners believed the pale things didn't like fire, though there was debate about whether this was actually effective or just gave the workers a psychological boost. No whistling or singing. Sound seemed to attract attention. Several people reported seeing the pale things appear shortly after someone had made noise. If the fog gets thick, shut down immediately. Don't try to finish the batch. Don't try to wait it out. Pack up and get off the mountain. Never chase after someone who disappears into the fog. This was the hardest rule to follow, but it was learned through bitter experience. Every time someone went looking for a missing person in the fog, either they didn't come back or they came back having seen something that traumatized them. String bells or cans around the perimeter. This was supposed to give warning if something was approaching, though several people reported the pale things moving without triggering the noisemakers. Carry iron. This was pure folklore, but many moonshiners started carrying iron nails or horseshoes, believing it would ward off the pale things. No evidence this worked, but it made people feel better. These rules helped. The death rate among moonshiners dropped, but it didn't stop completely. And then the revenuers got involved. See, the federal government was getting frustrated. Despite their best efforts, moonshine production in Appalachia was actually increasing. The economic incentives were too strong. Every still they raided was replaced by 2 more. Every moonshiner they arrested was replaced by a cousin or a brother or a neighbor willing to take the risk. So in late 1921, the Bureau of Prohibition decided to try a different tactic. Instead of just raiding stills when they found them, they would establish a permanent presence in the mountains. They set up camps in the deep hollows, stationed agents there for weeks at a time, conducting systematic patrols. The goal was to make the mountains too dangerous for moonshiners to operate. Ironic, given what was already out there. The first revenue camp was established in Madison County, North Carolina, in October 1921. 6 agents, led by a veteran named William Garrett. They set up in a hollow that was known to have at least 3 active stills within a 5-mile radius. The moonshiners in that area mostly shut down or relocated. Too risky to operate with feds camped practically on top of you. But they knew something the revenue agents didn't. That hollow was fog country. The moonshiners tried to warn them in their own way. Anonymous notes left at the camp. Local people refusing to serve as guides. One old woman who sold eggs to the agents told them straight out, "You boys should move your camp. This ain't a good place after dark." The agents thought this was intimidation tactics, moonshiners trying to scare them off. On October 29, 1921, 3 of the 6 agents disappeared. According to the official report, filed by William Garrett and the 2 surviving agents, the 3 men had gone on an evening patrol. It was foggy, but not unusually so. When they didn't return by midnight, Garrett organized a search. They found one agent's rifle, dropped on a trail. Found another agent's jacket, torn and abandoned. But no bodies. The search continued for 3 days. Federal agents from across the region poured into Madison County. This wasn't some moonshiner nobody cared about. These were government employees. The Bureau of Prohibition demanded answers. They never found the 3 men. But on the fourth day, they found something else. A dozen witnesses, including 5 federal agents, reported seeing a pale figure standing on a ridgeline above the camp. It was visible for maybe 90 seconds before the fog obscured it. Multiple people took photographs, though the image quality was poor given the distance and the weather. I've seen 2 of those photographs. They're held in the National Archives, buried in a file labeled Madison County Investigation, 1921. The figure is indistinct, could be argued as a trick of light and fog, but the proportions are wrong. Too tall, too thin. And there's something about the way it's standing, perfectly still on that ridge, that raises the hair on the back of your neck. The revenue camp was abandoned the next day. The official reason given was reassignment of resources. But Garrett wrote a confidential memo to his superiors, later uncovered through a Freedom of Information Act request in the 1990s, that told a different story. The men are terrified, Garrett wrote. They refuse to sleep in the camp. 2 have requested immediate transfer. Whatever the local population has been reporting, I believe there is substance to it. I strongly recommend we withdraw from this area until we have a better understanding of the situation. The Bureau of Prohibition did not take kindly to this recommendation. As far as they were concerned, Garrett had been spooked by moonshiner scare tactics. He was reassigned to a desk job in Washington. The official position was that the 3 missing agents had probably been killed by moonshiners and their bodies hidden. But privately, the Bureau started keeping track of incidents in the Appalachian region. They compiled reports, interviewed agents, documented the growing number of mysterious deaths and disappearances. What they found was disturbing. Between 1920 and 1923, 17 federal agents died or disappeared under mysterious circumstances in the Appalachian Mountains. Not all of them showed the same characteristics as the moonshiner deaths. Some were genuinely killed by moonshiners in shootouts, others died in accidents. But at least 9 cases matched the pattern, found dead with no signs of violence, darkened veins, dilated pupils, in locations that didn't make sense. The Bureau also documented over 60 sightings of what witnesses described as pale figures, white things, or fog walkers. These sightings came from agents, moonshiners, local residents, even tourists passing through the mountains. The descriptions were remarkably consistent. Tall, thin figures, usually seen at a distance, white or pale gray in color, moving in ways that didn't match normal human locomotion, often appearing in fog or mist, usually silent, though some witnesses reported a low humming or buzzing sound. In July 1923, the Bureau of Prohibition held a classified meeting in Washington to discuss what they were calling the Appalachian situation. 16 people attended, including senior Bureau officials, 2 scientists from the Smithsonian Institution, and a folklore expert from Yale. The minutes from that meeting were declassified in 2003. They make for fascinating reading. The Bureau officials wanted to know what they were dealing with. The scientists suggested various explanations: mass hallucination brought on by stress and isolation, misidentification of known animals, bears standing upright, deer in fog, or possibly some kind of atmospheric phenomenon that was causing both the fog and the psychological effects. The folklore expert, a professor named Albert Stein, had a different theory. Stein had spent years collecting Appalachian folklore and was familiar with regional legends about the hollow folk, or the pale people, entities that supposedly lived deep in the mountains, rarely seen by humans and best left alone. These legends dated back to the earliest European settlement of the region, and possibly earlier. Some Cherokee stories spoke of similar beings. According to Stein, the pale things weren't new, they'd always been in the mountains. But human activity had been limited enough that encounters were rare and easily dismissed as folklore. Prohibition changed that. Suddenly, thousands of people were working in the deepest, most remote parts of the mountains, at night, in all weather conditions. People were going places humans normally didn't go, doing things humans normally didn't do, and they were encountering things that had previously been left alone. Stein's theory was met with skepticism by most of the attendees. This was 1923. The United States was rapidly modernizing. Science and rationality were ascendant. The idea that there might be unknown creatures living in the mountains Creatures that had somehow evaded discovery despite centuries of human habitation seemed absurd. But nobody had a better explanation. The Bureau decided on a policy of studied ignorance. They would continue enforcement efforts against moonshiners, but they would avoid establishing permanent camps in remote areas. Agents were instructed to work in large groups and avoid nighttime operations where possible. Reports of pale things would be filed, but not investigated unless they involved federal personnel. Essentially, they decided to pretend the problem didn't exist. This worked about as well as you'd expect. The period from 1924 to 1927 saw the peak of moonshine production in Appalachia and the peak of pale thing encounters. The economy was booming, demand for illegal alcohol was at an all-time high, and moonshiners were operating on a scale that would have been unthinkable before Prohibition. Entire communities were involved. Women and children would help with the work during daylight hours. Local merchants provided supplies, knowing exactly what they were being used for. Sheriffs looked the other way, often after receiving generous donations. It was an open secret that the mountains were drowning in moonshine, and the pale things were everywhere. I've collected over 200 documented sightings from this period. Not all of them credible, mind you. Some are obvious fabrications, others are second-hand stories that got embellished in the telling. But even being conservative, there are at least 70 sightings I consider reliable, meaning they come from witnesses who had no obvious reason to lie and whose accounts contain specific details that can be verified. The sightings cluster around certain geographic areas: the Great Smoky Mountains along the Tennessee-North Carolina border, the Black Mountains of North Carolina, parts of the Cumberland Plateau in Kentucky and Tennessee. These were the prime moonshining territories, the most remote and rugged sections of the Appalachians. But there were also sightings in unexpected places. A pale thing was reportedly seen in 1925 near a still operation in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, only 15 miles from a town of 5,000 people. Another was spotted in 1926 in West Virginia, in an area that was being actively logged, not exactly pristine wilderness. The pattern suggested the pale things weren't simply native wildlife. They were following the moonshiners, appearing wherever the stills operated. Which led to the question, why? Several theories emerged among the moonshiners themselves. Some believed the pale things were attracted to the smell of fermenting corn mash. Others thought it was the heat from the stills that drew them. A few people argued the pale things were somehow territorial, defending their mountain habitat from human intrusion. But the most disturbing theory, which gained traction in certain communities, was that the pale things were feeding. This theory came from careful observation of the bodies. Remember, the victims showed darkened veins and partially translucent skin, as if drained of blood, but no wounds to explain the blood loss. Several moonshiners began to suspect that the pale things were somehow extracting blood or life force without leaving physical marks. A moonshiner named Jacob Hensley, who operated in the mountains of East Tennessee, became obsessed with this question. Hensley had lost his brother to the pale things in 1924 and was determined to understand what had killed him. He started keeping detailed notes, interviewing other moonshiners, documenting every encounter he could find. Hensley's notes eventually made their way to a doctor in Knoxville, who showed them to a colleague at Johns Hopkins University. That doctor, whose name was Ernest Hammond, became intrigued enough to travel to Tennessee in 1926 to investigate personally. Hammond was a hematologist, a blood specialist, and he was able to examine 3 bodies that showed the characteristic pale thing death pattern. What he found was published in a medical journal in 1927 in a paper titled Unusual Blood Pathology in Rural Tennessee Deaths. The paper is written in careful clinical language that avoids mentioning pale things or moonshiners directly. But Hammond documented that all 3 bodies showed extreme dilation of the capillaries, as if the blood vessels had been subjected to intense suction. The blood itself had undergone a chemical change he couldn't explain. It was darker, thicker, and showed signs of rapid coagulation that shouldn't have occurred in living tissue. Hammond's conclusion was carefully worded. The pathology observed suggests exposure to an unknown environmental factor that causes rapid systemic changes in blood chemistry and circulation. The specific mechanism remains unclear and warrants further investigation. In private correspondence with Jacob Hensley, Hammond was more direct. He wrote, "I believe your brother and the others were subjected to some form of extraction. Whatever killed them was feeding on their blood, but doing so in a manner I cannot explain with current medical knowledge. I wish I could provide more answers, but I am as baffled as you are." Hammond wanted to conduct more research, but he died in a car accident in 1928 before he could return to Tennessee. His research notes were filed away and forgotten until I stumbled across them while going through Johns Hopkins archives. Jacob Hensley, meanwhile, continued his investigation. He became convinced that the pale things could be avoided if you understood their patterns. He mapped out all the encounters he could document, noting dates, times, weather conditions, and locations. What he found was suggestive but not conclusive. The pale things seemed more active during certain lunar phases. New moon periods saw more sightings than full moons. They appeared more frequently in autumn and spring than in summer or winter, and they strongly preferred foggy conditions, though there were occasional sightings in clear weather. Hensley also documented something interesting. The pale things seemed to avoid certain areas where moonshiners had been operating for generations. The oldest still sites, some of which had been in continuous use since before the Civil War, rarely saw pale thing activity. It was the new operations, the stills set up in previously undisturbed areas, that attracted attention. This suggested the pale things might be territorial, but in a more complex way than simple animal behavior. It was as if they tolerated human presence that had been established for long enough, but reacted aggressively to new intrusions. Hensley shared his findings with other moonshiners, and it became common practice to preferentially use old still sites rather than establishing new ones. This meant higher risk of discovery by revenuers, but lower risk of encountering the pale things. And most moonshiners considered the pale things the greater danger. Think about that for a moment. Federal agents with guns and legal authority were less frightening than these mysterious entities in the fog. The year 1929 marked a turning point, though not for any supernatural reason. The stock market crash in October brought the Roaring Twenties to a screeching halt. The Great Depression began, and suddenly the economics of moonshining changed. Before the crash, moonshiners were supplying a luxury market. People with money to burn wanted illegal booze for parties and speakeasies. After the crash, those people were broke. Demand didn't disappear, but prices collapsed. At the same time, desperate people flooded into the moonshine business, creating oversupply. Many moonshiners went broke. Still operations that had employed dozens of people shut down. The smaller family-run stills survived, but the large-scale commercial operations mostly folded. And something interesting happened. Pale thing encounters decreased dramatically. In 1928, I've documented 43 credible sightings. In 1930, only 12. By 1932, down to 7. This correlation is suggestive. If the pale things were connected to moonshine activity, it makes sense that their sightings would decrease as that activity declined. But correlation isn't causation. It's possible the decrease had nothing to do with moonshining and everything to do with some other factor we don't understand. Then came 1933, and everything changed again. On December 5, 1933, the 21st Amendment was ratified, repealing Prohibition. After 13 years, alcohol was legal again. The moonshiners expected this to be the end of their business. Why buy illegal corn liquor when you could buy legal whiskey from a store? But the transition wasn't immediate. Legal alcohol production took time to ramp up, distribution networks had to be rebuilt, and legal whiskey was expensive compared to moonshine. The moonshine industry didn't disappear overnight. It contracted, certainly. Many moonshiners went legitimate, opening legal distilleries or finding other work. But plenty continued operating, especially in the most remote mountain areas, where legal alcohol was hard to obtain, and moonshine remained cheaper. The pale things should have continued to appear. They didn't. After Prohibition ended, sightings dropped to almost zero. I've found only 3 documented encounters between 1934 and 1940, and all 3 are questionable. Second-hand reports with limited detail. It was as if the pale things vanished along with Prohibition. This is the part of the story that keeps me up at night, because it suggests the pale things weren't just attracted to moonshine stills or human activity in general. They were specifically connected to Prohibition-era moonshining. But how? Why? Several theories attempt to explain this, none of them entirely satisfying. Theory 1. The scale factor. During Prohibition, moonshining reached an unprecedented scale, thousands of stills, operating constantly, processing tons of corn. This level of activity disrupted the mountains in a way that previous human habitation hadn't. The pale things were responding to this disruption, and when the scale decreased, they retreated. Theory 2. The transgression hypothesis. This is more esoteric. Some researchers have suggested that the pale things were somehow enforcing natural law or cosmic order. Prohibition represented a disruption of traditional patterns. It made criminal what had been legal, drove people into secretive nighttime activity in remote locations. The pale things appeared in response to this transgression and disappeared when the natural order was restored. Theory 3. The attention effect. This is my least favorite, but I have to mention it. Some skeptics argue that the pale things were always there, but only got noticed during Prohibition because so many people were working in the mountains at night. Once Prohibition ended and that activity decreased, the encounters declined. Not because the pale things left, but because humans stopped going places where they'd encounter them. Theory 4. The government experiment. This is pure conspiracy theory, but it's popular in certain circles. The theory goes that the pale things weren't natural at all, but some kind of biological or psychological weapon tested by the government during Prohibition. The goal was to scare moonshiners into quitting without having to arrest them. When Prohibition ended, the program was discontinued. I don't buy Theory 4. The logistics would be impossible to hide, and the government's own records show they were as baffled by the pale things as everyone else. But the fact that this theory exists tells you how unsatisfying the official "nothing to see here" position has been. My own theory, and this is speculation, I want to be clear, combines elements of the first two. I think the pale things are real entities, probably some kind of cryptid species that has existed in the Appalachian Mountains for a very long time. They're rare, they avoid humans, and they have some kind of territorial behavior. During Prohibition, human activity in their territory increased dramatically and changed in character. Instead of occasional hunters or small-scale settlers, suddenly there were thousands of people operating industrial-scale stills in the deepest wilderness areas, working at night, creating noise and heat and chemical smells. This was unprecedented. The pale things reacted defensively. They didn't attack immediately. Remember, encounters were actually relatively rare given how many moonshiners were operating. But when humans entered certain territories or violated certain behavioral norms, the pale things would respond. The blood-draining aspect suggests predation, but selective predation. They weren't trying to wipe out the moonshiners. They were enforcing boundaries. When Prohibition ended and the large-scale commercial moonshining collapsed, human pressure on pale thing territory decreased. The creatures retreated back into their deepest hiding places. Encounters became rare again, as they had been before Prohibition. This theory has problems. It doesn't explain why the pale things would specifically target moonshiners, rather than, say, loggers or miners who were also disturbing the mountains. It doesn't explain the blood pathology or the impossible physics of bullets passing through them. And it doesn't explain where these creatures came from or why they've never been definitively documented. But it fits the evidence better than any alternative I've encountered. What about modern sightings? Do the pale things still exist? The answer is maybe. After 1940, reports become sporadic and less credible. There are occasional stories from hikers, hunters, and park rangers in the Appalachian region about seeing strange pale figures in fog or mist. But these lack the consistent details and corroboration of the Prohibition-era sightings. The creation of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park in 1934 and other protected wilderness areas changed human access to the mountains. Large sections became much less trafficked, giving any remaining pale things plenty of space to avoid people. There are 3 modern reports I find intriguing. In 1983, 2 experienced hikers on the Appalachian Trail in Tennessee reported seeing a tall, pale figure watching them from a ridge at dawn. They both described the same details independently. Unusually tall, thin, wrong proportions. They took a photograph, but it came out too blurry to show anything definitive. In 1997, a park ranger in the Great Smoky Mountains was driving a remote service road in heavy fog when something crossed in front of his vehicle. He described it as like a person, but stretched out, moving in a gliding motion. By the time he stopped the truck, it had disappeared into the forest. He filed an official report, which was dismissed as a misidentified deer. In 2015, a group of college students camping illegally in a restricted area of the Nantahala National Forest in North Carolina claimed to have encountered a pale figure that approached their camp around 2 a.m. They ran and didn't return for their gear until the next day. The story went viral on social media, but was generally treated as a creepypasta-style fabrication. None of these reports have the weight of the Prohibition-era evidence, but they suggest that something might still be out there. Here's what I think we can say with confidence. During Prohibition, between 1920 and 1933, something unusual happened in the Appalachian Mountains. Dozens of people died under mysterious circumstances. Hundreds of credible witnesses reported seeing strange, pale entities. These encounters were documented in official records, investigated by law enforcement and federal agents, and left a paper trail that still exists today. The skeptical explanation that this was all folklore, misidentification, and coincidence doesn't adequately account for the specific, consistent details in the reports. The pattern is too clear. The coroner's reports are too strange. The government response is too documented. Something was out there, whether it was a biological creature, a psychological phenomenon, an environmental factor we don't understand, or something else entirely. We can't say for certain. The evidence is suggestive, but not conclusive. But the moonshiners who lived through it had no doubt. They knew what they'd seen. They knew what had killed their friends and family. And they knew enough to fear the fog. Let me tell you one final story. This one comes from an interview I conducted in 2019 with a woman named Doris McCain, who was 94 years old at the time. Doris grew up in Sevier County, Tennessee, in the 1920s. Her father and uncle ran a still operation during Prohibition. Doris remembered the pale things clearly, though she never saw one herself. She remembered her father coming home one night in 1926, pale and shaking, refusing to talk about what he'd seen. She remembered her uncle disappearing for 3 days and returning with no explanation. She remembered the rules: never work alone, never stay out in heavy fog, never investigate strange sounds. Most of all, she remembered the fear. People today don't understand, she told me. They think Prohibition was just about illegal booze, like it was some kind of adventure. But for us, it was terrifying. You had the revenuers who could arrest you and destroy your livelihood. You had rival moonshiners who might kill you over territory. And then you had the pale things, which were worse than all of that. I asked her what made the pale things worse. Because you couldn't understand them, she said. The revenuers, they had a job to do. The rival moonshiners, they wanted money. You could make sense of that. But the pale things, they didn't want nothing you could give them. They just took. And you couldn't fight them, couldn't run from them if they wanted you. All you could do was hope they'd leave you alone. She paused, looking out the window of her nursing home room at the mountains in the distance. My daddy stopped moonshining in 1933, soon as Prohibition ended. Said he was done with those mountains after dark. He lived another 40 years and never once went back into the deep woods at night. He'd seen something that changed him. Never told me exactly what, but I could see it in his eyes whenever the fog rolled in. Doris McCain died 6 months after our interview. She was one of the last people alive who remembered the Prohibition era in Appalachia from personal experience. With her generation gone, we've lost direct access to that history, but the stories remain, the documents remain. And somewhere in the Appalachian Mountains, in the deep hollows where the fog pools thick and the trees grow dense, something might still remain as well. So what's the lesson here? What are we supposed to take away from the story of the pale things? First, I think it's a reminder that history is stranger than we usually acknowledge. We like our history clean and rational, economic forces, political movements, technological progress. But sometimes there are elements that don't fit the narrative. loose ends that dangle uncomfortably. The pale things are one of those loose ends. They're documented well enough that we can't simply dismiss them, but not documented well enough that we can say definitively what they were. That ambiguity is uncomfortable for modern minds that want clear answers. Second, it's a reminder of the limits of human knowledge. We think we understand the world. We've mapped it, studied it, categorized it. But there are still blank spaces on the map, still phenomena we can't explain. The Appalachian Mountains, despite being in the eastern United States, despite being surrounded by civilization, contained something unknown. That's humbling. It suggests that even in our modern technological age, there might be things out there we don't understand and can't control. Third, and most importantly, the pale things represent the consequences of disruption. Whether they were real creatures, psychological manifestations, or something else, they appeared when humans massively altered their behavior and relationship with the mountains. Prohibition drove thousands of people into the wilderness at night, operating on industrial scales in places that had previously been left alone. That disruption had consequences. We see this pattern throughout environmental history. When humans push into new territories or dramatically change their activity patterns, unexpected things happen. Species go extinct, ecosystems collapse, diseases emerge. Usually we can trace these consequences through conventional biology and ecology. But what if some consequences are stranger than that? What if disrupting an environment in unprecedented ways creates opportunities for encounters with things that usually remain hidden? The pale things might have always been in the Appalachian Mountains, living deep in the most remote areas, rarely crossing paths with humans because humans rarely ventured into their territory. Prohibition changed that equation. Suddenly, their territory was full of humans, every night, all across the mountains. Some territories they might have ceded, others they defended. The moonshiners who died might have been unfortunate enough to cross the wrong boundaries. This interpretation casts the pale things not as supernatural entities or government experiments, but as a natural response to human intrusion. Like bears that become aggressive when humans get too close to their dens, or wolves that attack when their territory is threatened, except the pale things were far more effective than bears or wolves, and far more mysterious. I want to be clear, I don't know what the pale things were. Nobody does. Despite 3 years of research, hundreds of documents reviewed, dozens of interviews conducted, I can't give you a definitive answer. What I can tell you is that the moonshiners of 1920s Appalachia feared something specific. Not the abstract fear of the dark or the unknown, but a concrete fear of tall, pale figures in the fog that could kill without leaving marks and move in ways that defied physics. That fear was real. It was documented. It changed behavior. And for 13 years, during the strange intersection of prohibition law and mountain culture, that fear shaped life and death in the Appalachian highlands. When I walk in the mountains now, which I do regularly, both for enjoyment and as part of my research, I think about the pale things. I think about the moonshiners who worked these trails at night, carrying jugs of shine, always listening for footsteps or the absence of footsteps. I think about the fog that pools in the hollows, thick and white, obscuring whatever might be moving through it. And I'll admit, when the fog is particularly heavy, when I'm deep in the woods and the light is failing, I walk a little faster. I stay on established trails. I make noise so anything out there knows I'm coming. Is this rational? Probably not. The pale things, if they existed, seem to have been specifically connected to Prohibition-era moonshining. They haven't been reliably reported in decades. The chances of encountering one are essentially zero. But the moonshiners who followed their rules about fog and darkness and never working alone, they survived. The ones who didn't, the ones who dismissed the warnings as superstition, a lot of them ended up as strange entries in coroners' reports. So I follow the rules, just in case, because here's the final truth about the pale things. We don't know they're gone. We know they were there during Prohibition. We know encounters decreased dramatically after 1933. But absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. The deep Appalachian wilderness still exists. Millions of acres of forest, much of it roadless, much of it rarely visited by humans. If there are pale things, if they're biological entities that can reproduce and persist, They could still be out there, waiting in the fog, watching from the ridgelines, defending their territory against intrusions. The moonshiners learned to respect that. They learned the price of ignoring the warnings. And though Prohibition is long over, though the moonshine industry has mostly shifted to legal craft distilleries, though the mountains are now national parks and tourist destinations, the lesson remains. Some boundaries shouldn't be crossed, some territories should be left alone. And some things in the fog are better left unseen. The pale things of Appalachia remain one of America's strangest historical mysteries. They're too well documented to dismiss entirely, too strange to explain conventionally. They exist in that uncomfortable space between folklore and fact, where the evidence suggests something real happened, but the rational explanations fall short. Maybe someday we'll have answers. Maybe someone will find definitive proof. A body, clear photographs, biological samples. Maybe a pale thing will be captured or killed, dissected and categorized, its mysteries solved by science. Or maybe they'll remain what they've always been, shadows in the fog, warnings in the night, the price of going too deep into territory that isn't ours. The moonshiners of the 1920s paid that price. 47 documented deaths, dozens more disappearances, hundreds of people traumatized by encounters they couldn't explain. That's not folklore. That's history. Dark history, certainly. Strange history. History that doesn't fit comfortably in textbooks, but history nonetheless. And the lesson of that history is simple. The world still holds mysteries. Even in modern, mapped, civilized America, there are things we don't understand, forces we can't explain, boundaries we cross at our peril. The pale things taught the moonshiners that lesson in the harshest possible way. We'd be wise to remember it. Because the fog still rolls through the Appalachian Mountains on autumn nights, it still pools in the hollows, thick and white, obscuring the trees and trails. And somewhere in that fog, somewhere in the deep wilderness that has never been fully tamed, maybe something is still waiting, still watching, still defending territory that humans were never meant to claim. The moonshiners knew, and they feared. With good reason.